Well, this month in the Smyth and Helwys Formation series, we begin a new study entitled The Temple and the Covenant. And we'll be taking a look at the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Here's a quote from the introduction to the unit. In this unit, we will explore the temple's significance for Israel and seek to discern how its message relates to our own journey of faith today. Well, First and Second Chronicles originally was one book. Later it was divided, or we think so, and it was written during the aftermath of the Babylonian exile. This was during a time when the writers were naturally drawn to the history of Israel and the stories of ancient Israel's glory. And they were especially drawn to the reign of David, who was Israel's greatest king. So this month, as we go through our study, we'll be taking a look at three of Israel's most famous kings. David, we'll take a look at Solomon, and of course Josiah. David had the vision for building the temple. Solomon actually built it, and Josiah later restored it. So the story today takes place from First Chronicles towards the end of the book, next to the last chapter, chapter 28. Our focal verses are 2 through 3, 5 through 10, and 20 through 21. And as you read this chapter, the story goes like this. David tells the people assembled there in Israel that it had been his plan all along to build the temple. In fact, we see that he has very elaborate plans down to the very minute details about this temple. It was always his plan to build God's temple. But God came to him and said, it's not for you because you are a warrior. But instead, I've chosen your son, Solomon, to build my temple. And I've also chosen him to be my son. And God goes on to talk about the relationship and the covenant that he'll have with Solomon. David, probably in a bittersweet moment, maybe disappointed that he didn't get to fulfill his dream to build God's temple, perhaps his greatest achievement, but also equally proud that it's his son who's being chosen. Now it's interesting, Solomon would not have been the natural selection. He wasn't the oldest son. That's normally how the next king would come along. But God chose Solomon. In fact, Solomon is only the second king that God chose. He chose David, and now he's choosing Solomon. And so it was a bit of a surprise because, again, Solomon was not the oldest son of David. Now, Solomon, as you may remember, was the son of David and Bathsheba. So we see that in the balance of this particular chapter, David is basically playing the role of mentor as he encourages Solomon that God will provide everything he needs, but that Solomon needs to be faithful. So it's a historical book. We learn a lot about the history of Israel. We learn about David's disappointment, perhaps, but also about his joy that his son is being chosen to build the temple. And we see the interaction between David and Solomon, David and God. So what's in this story for you and I today as we look at it? Well, I think there's maybe 4 points that I'd like for us to take a look at. First of all, we are all called to specific tasks. When we studied Experiencing God a few years ago, that book had some very significant, provided very significant understanding for me and perhaps other members of our class and our church who studied that, went through that Bible study. What we learned is that if we focus on what God really wants from us, which is a relationship, God doesn't really need us to do anything. He wants us to have a relationship with him. And if we work on building that relationship, God will reveal himself to us, and he'll reveal to us how he is at work in and around us in the world. We also learned that when we sense that revelation, we need to understand that's God's invitation for us to join him. And if we will do that, he will provide us with the resources necessary to be able to fulfill those tasks that we're called to. So that's how it works in the kingdom. Now, one of the things that I think is a second point that we want to make here is that we don't always get to do what we want. I can only imagine that David, being the high achievement, high performing type A personality that I read him to be, would have naturally thought, well, hey, this will be the crowning achievement of my life here, building the house of the Lord. And it would have probably made sense for David that he would be able to do that. But God said, no, it's not for you. I'm going to choose someone else to do that. Well, you might be able to relate to that. Maybe there's been a time in your life when you didn't get to do what it is that you really wanted to do. That maybe that job was given to someone else. And if you've ever experienced that, you know about the heartbreak that we feel when that happens. We need to remember that in God's kingdom, it's always about God. The story is not, the Bible is not the book about David. The Bible is a story about God. David simply handled some tasks that God had called him to do, just like Moses before him, just like Abraham before him. And so we need to always be aware that when God reveals to us something to have us do, we need to be careful not to make it about us. It needs to be about God. We also need to be aware of our bias. One of the things that can happen to us is we can decide that we're not good at children's ministry, or we can decide that we can't teach adults, or we can decide that, doing some of the lower profile, less visible jobs around the church aren't going to give us a lot of fulfillment. But we have to be very careful about that bias, because when God reveals to us the work He's doing and invites us to join Him, if we apply our bias, we will pick and choose, and that's not really being faithful to God and to the relationship with God. Whatever task we're assigned, find joy in that task. One of the things we see in today's story is that David finds joy in the task of becoming the mentor when he realizes he's not going to be the one who builds the temple. And so for you and I, we need to find joy in whatever that task is, no matter how big or how small, because in the end, it's all about God. The third point that we see here is God will always provide us with what we need when He calls us to this task. Solomon was being called to a large task, and David becomes part of God's provision because David gives him wise counsel and encourages him to be obedient and to be faithful and to be single-minded. Uh, David also hands him the plans. David had great architectural plans that we read about in this chapter. And David also hands him a workforce that is organized and ready to go to work. So Solomon is given the provisions when God called him to the task. And finally, reading a quote from our student book, our responsibility is to be obedient enough to live up to the gifts God has given and to serve Him wholeheartedly. Listen to what Solomon says to David. He says, this is in verse 9, serve Him with single mind and willing heart. For the Lord searches every mind and understands every plan and thought. If you seek Him, He will be found by you. But if you forsake Him, He will abandon you forever. Take heed now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house as the sanctuary. Be strong and act. Let that be our takeaway from today's lesson, that God has tasks for each of us. And when God reveals that task to us, be strong and act. Take heed because God has chosen you to that particular task. Well, I don't know about you, but there are many things that really speak to me about this story. I'm not sure what part of this lesson speaks to you and what word in this you need to hear this morning. Maybe you need to be reminded that just because you didn't get the task you'd hoped for, maybe you need to be reminded that you still are being given a task. And maybe you need to find joy in that task. Or maybe you find yourself in the Solomon's shoes, where you're being given a task that seems overwhelming, and you need to be reminded that God will be faithful to you if you will seek Him and serve Him wholeheartedly. Or maybe you need to hear the word about bias this morning when it comes to tasks. Maybe you are limiting God's ability to work in your life by seeing that you have strengths and weaknesses, and somehow those determine how God can use you. Nothing can be further from the truth. Well, I hope somewhere in this today there's been a word for you. I also hope you'll join us again next week as we continue in our study of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Until then, have a great week. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.